There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know this exhaustion. It is the one that greets you in the morning before the day has even begun, the one that sits behind your eyes when you are in the middle of a conversation and you realize, with a quiet alarm, that you have no idea what you actually think anymore. You have been performing your life for so long, moving through its obligations and its pleasures and its small rituals, and somewhere along the way, the thread that once connected you to yourself went slack. You cannot quite remember when it happened. Maybe it was gradual, a slow accumulation of compromises you told yourself were reasonable, of opinions you swallowed because speaking them felt like too much trouble, of desires you postponed until postponing them became a habit so deep it started to feel like preference. Or maybe there was a moment, a single season of your life when everything you thought was solid revealed itself as provisional, and you have been living in the aftermath of that revelation ever since, not quite knowing what to build in the rubble. Either way, you are here now, and you sense that something must change. Not in your circumstances necessarily, not in your job or your relationships or your address. Something must change in the interior architecture of who you are. Something must, in the most honest sense of the word, die. What I want to explore with you today is not a self-improvement program. It is something more serious and more liberating than that. It is an examination of the specific things inside us that block the light of genuine clarity, the accumulated structures of identity and habit and assumption that we mistake for ourselves, but that are, in truth, the very obstacles between us and the life we are actually capable of living. The philosopher Hannah Arendt spent her life thinking about what it means to be genuinely present in the world, to think, to act, to exist with intentionality rather than simply be carried along by the current of convention and habit. She understood that the greatest danger to human freedom is not external oppression, though she knew that intimately, but internal thoughtlessness, the refusal or inability to examine the assumptions that govern our lives. She called the unexamined performance of inherited roles and narratives a kind of banality, not evil in the dramatic sense, but hollow, an abdication of the responsibility to think for oneself. What I want to suggest to you today is that this same banality lives inside each of us in very specific forms, and that naming those forms, seeing them clearly, is the beginning of something that deserves to be called clarity. If this way of thinking about your situation is opening something up for you, consider subscribing. I explore these questions every week, and I would be glad to have you along for the continued journey. The first thing that must die within you is the identity you built from your wound. Every one of us carries a story about why we are the way we are. Something happened, perhaps in childhood, perhaps in early adulthood, perhaps in a relationship that ended badly, and we constructed a self around that event. We became the person who was abandoned, or the person who was never good enough, or the person who learned early that the world is not safe and that vigilance is the only protection. These identities are not lies. They emerged from real experiences, and for a time they served a genuine protective function. The problem is not their origin, but their persistence. At some point, the story we built from our wound stopped describing our experience and started prescribing it. We began to see every new situation through the lens of that original injury, to expect betrayal where none was intended, to preemptively withdraw before we could be rejected, to remain perpetually small so that we would never again be seen as a threat. The wound identity is extraordinarily seductive because it gives us something that human beings crave above almost everything else: coherence. It makes our behavior make sense, to ourselves and to others. But coherence purchased at the cost of growth is a form of self-imprisonment. The clarity you are seeking requires that this identity be surrendered, not because your suffering was not real, but because you are more than what happened to you. You are also what you choose to do with what happened to you, and that choice remains available in every moment, but only if the wound story loses its grip on your imagination. The second thing that must die is the version of yourself that lives in other people's perception. This one is subtler and in some ways more insidious, because it operates almost entirely below the threshold of awareness. We each carry an internal audience, a composite figure made up of parents, teachers, peers, partners, critics, and the vague, judgmental public we imagine is always watching. We have learned to pre-censure ourselves according to what this internal audience will approve of, to edit our speech and our desires, and even our private thoughts in anticipation of their verdict. Arendt wrote beautifully about what she called the space of appearance, the public realm in which we show ourselves to others and receive recognition in return. But she also understood that this space can become a trap when we confuse the performance for the performer, when we become so identified with how we appear that we lose access to what we actually are. You have almost certainly experienced this. There are opinions you hold that you have never spoken aloud because you are not sure they would be well received. There are ways you want to live that you have never permitted yourself because they do not fit the image that others have of you and that you have come to protect as though it were your life rather than merely its surface. When this version of yourself dies, and it must die if you are to live with any real clarity, what remains is not chaos, but something far more interesting. What remains is the irreducible particular of who you actually are. I know that many of you watching this have never said any of this out loud. You have been carrying these questions alone, not sure anyone would understand, maybe not sure you understood them yourself. So let me ask you something directly. How long have you been living as a version of yourself that someone else would approve of? How long has it been since you said something or did something simply because it was true for you, without calculating the reaction? Share your answer in the comments below. Not because I need to know, but because someone else watching this right now needs to see that they are not the only one asking. And if the words feel hard to find right now, just type this: I have been living for their approval. That is enough. Because when you write it, you make it real. And when you make it real, you give others permission to do the same. Your honesty is not just for you. It matters to the whole community of people watching in silence. The third thing that must die is your relationship to certainty. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, because what you are seeking is clarity. And clarity sounds like the arrival of certainty, like the moment when the fog finally lifts and you can see exactly where you are and exactly where you need to go. But the clarity I am pointing toward is not that kind of clarity. Genuine clarity does not eliminate uncertainty. It teaches you to move within it without being paralyzed by it. Most of us have developed what can only be called a terror of not knowing. We fill silence with distraction. We rush to form opinions before we have fully understood the question. We mistake confidence for competence and confuse the feeling of certainty with the possession of truth. We do this because uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable and the discomfort is not trivial. It touches something deep in our nervous systems, something ancient and afraid. But consider what this compulsion costs you. When you cannot tolerate not knowing, you foreclose the very space in which genuine thinking occurs. You grab the first available answer and defend it not because it is true, but because having an answer, any answer, feels safer than living in the open question. Arendt understood that thinking requires a willingness to remain in what she called the gap between past and future, the present moment of genuine uncertainty, without rushing toward resolution. The death of your need for premature certainty is not a loss. It is the opening of a vastly more interesting and honest relationship with reality. The fourth thing that must die is the habit of living in the future. I do not mean planning, which is practical and necessary. I mean the particular psychological tendency to locate your real life somewhere ahead of you, in the version of yourself who has finally figured it out, who has lost the weight, earned the recognition, resolved the relationship, achieved the goal, arrived. You probably recognize this. It is the quiet background assumption that your life has not yet properly begun, that you are still in preparation for the actual event. You will be happy when. You will be at peace after. You will finally be yourself once. This is one of the most effective ways we have found to defer the full weight of being alive. It is also one of the most painful, because the future self never arrives. Every time you reach one of your conditional thresholds, the conditions simply shift. The happiness you expected to feel at the destination reveals itself as belonging to some further destination, and you find yourself exactly where you started, still waiting, still not quite living. What must die is not your hope or your ambition, but the specific belief that your real life is elsewhere. Arendt wrote about natality, the capacity for beginning something genuinely new, and she understood this capacity as existing not in some future state, but in each present moment of genuine action. The life you are waiting for does not exist in the future. It exists in the quality of attention you bring to what is actually happening right now. If what we are exploring here resonates with you, I want to invite you to join this community. I create these explorations for people who are not satisfied with easy answers, who want to think seriously about the questions that actually matter. There are many of us on this journey, people who have grown tired of performing and who are genuinely interested in understanding. Consider subscribing, not as a consumer looking for content, but as a fellow traveler who finds it useful to think alongside others. I will be here every week with another thread to pull on, and I would be genuinely honored to have you as part of this. Hit subscribe if this feels right, and let me know in the comments which of these 5 things you are most ready to release. Your reflection will illuminate something I may not have considered, and it will matter to others who are reading. The 5th thing that must die, and this is the most difficult of all, is the belief that clarity is a permanent state you will eventually achieve and then maintain. This belief is perhaps the deepest trap in all of spiritual and philosophical seeking. We imagine that somewhere ahead of us there is a stable plateau, a condition of permanent understanding and settled peace, and that all of our seeking and examining and questioning is moving us toward that plateau. We measure our progress by how close we feel we are getting to it, and we measure our failures by how far we seem to have fallen from it. But this model of growth is itself a distortion. Clarity is not a destination. It is a practice, a capacity, a way of relating to your experience that must be renewed in each moment, in each new challenge, in each encounter with something that threatens your understanding of yourself and the world. The philosopher who has arrived at permanent clarity has simply stopped thinking. Real clarity is not the end of questions, but the deepening of your capacity to inhabit them with honesty and courage. What must die is not your aspiration for understanding, but your fantasy that understanding will one day release you from the ongoing work of being alive. This is actually a liberation, though it may not feel like one immediately. Because when you release the fantasy of arrival, you are free to be fully present to the actual texture of your experience, to its confusion and its beauty and its irreducible particularity, without constantly measuring it against some imagined standard of how things should be when you have finally figured it out. So here is where we return to where we began. You came to this exploration exhausted, disconnected from yourself, sensing that something must change. And what I have tried to offer you is not a 5-step program for improvement, but an honest examination of the specific structures inside you that are blocking the clarity you are seeking. The wound identity that keeps you small. The performed self that lives for others' approval. The compulsive need for certainty that prevents genuine thinking. The postponed life that lives always in the future. And the fantasy of permanent arrival that turns a living practice into a distant destination. None of these things will die quickly or easily. They are deeply rooted, and they have served you in ways that deserve acknowledgement before they are released. But the seeing of them, the honest naming of them, is itself the beginning of something real. Arendt believed that thoughtfulness, the genuine willingness to examine the assumptions that govern our lives, is the most radical act available to a human being. Not dramatic revolution, but the quiet, courageous work of actually thinking, actually questioning, actually being present to what is real, rather than to what is merely habitual or expected or inherited. That is what I am inviting you to. Not a transformation that happens to you, but one that you participate in, with open eyes and a willingness to let go of what no longer serves the life you are actually here to live.